My name is Cheri-Leigh Erasmus, and I'm the Global Director of Learning at the Accountability Lab, a translocal network of organizations where we work on catalyzing civic engagement and responsible leadership by holding governments accountable. I'm honored today to be moderating this panel with really esteemed colleagues who I'll introduce in a minute. But maybe just to give a little bit of framing for this panel. Throughout the week, I'm sure just like me, you've been in several conversations around the use of technology in our anti-corruption efforts. I don't think any of us doubt that technology like artificial intelligence, open procurement systems, and many other tools give us a plethora of ways in which both companies and governments and civil society can be more accountable and transparent and contribute to our anti-corruption efforts. However, behind every tool, we have humans, right? And any data set or any tech tool is only as useful as its utilization. And so for this morning, we're hoping to really touch upon the utility of these tools, but more importantly, how do we get people to use them? There are numerous apps uploaded onto the iStore and Google Play every day that, despite being good ideas, just don't get adopted. And the same thing goes when it comes to open procurement systems, beneficial ownership registries, and so many other things. We need political will, and we need the behavior change to actually use these tools. So this morning, I'm joined by three panelists who will touch on this very topic. How do we make tools useful, and how do we ultimately get the people behind them to use them? So all the way on the right, we have Brooke Stearns Lawson, who serves as the Innovation, Research, and Learning Team Lead at USAID's Anti-Corruption Task Force. In her role, she oversees a small but mighty team leading on the Countering Transnational Corruption Grand Challenge for Development and the Anti-Corruption Task Force's Research, Learning, Monitoring, and Evaluation agenda. Thanks for joining us, Brooke. Next to Brooke, we have Andrea Ulrich, who's the Deputy Director of Programs at Development Gateway, a data for development nonprofit. In her role, she manages a team of 25 individuals who directly manage projects in the anti-corruption space. And then we have Ben Schmidt from the Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE, who serves as a program officer and the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center. I know that all of them look at the utility, usefulness of technology from different angles, so I'm really excited to hear from them this morning. We have structured our conversation to be as informal as possible. So we're doing away with really scripted and long presentations, and we're gonna frame this as a conversation. So just to kick us off, the first question I would love the panel to grapple with is to tell us a little bit more about the current challenges around the use of data and technology that they are trying to address in their work at the moment. And I'll hand it over to Andrea to kick us off first.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So once again, my name is Andrea. And just to give some context, because I think it'll be helpful as I share some of my initial thoughts. So again, as Cheri mentioned, I work at Development Gateway, and we are in this unique space because we are a data and digital nonprofit. And so we build dashboards, we build dashboards that show public procurement data, for example, but we also conduct ecosystem assessments. So we look at the broader environment in which these tools will be deployed. And so we sometimes say that we are techno-skeptics in addition to being tech providers. And I think that's a, kind of a unique framework that we're gonna be speaking about today. So just to say, in terms of challenges, obviously data is key here. As you've heard before, garbage in, garbage out, right? If it's true for machine learning, it's true for very straightforward data analysis. And just to say, when we talk about data challenges, a couple that we've seen on our projects are data completeness and data quality challenges. So both of those are really relevant to focusing on when we're looking at generating useful insights. And then another challenge that I'll mention is around, when we've talked with civil society, they express a lot of frustration, a lot of challenges with using the procurement data for anti-corruption, right? So there's just the struggle that they've been reporting having using this data effectively. So, I'll just say these challenges matter because obviously it's all about, yes, building well-designed tech that responds to what we're trying to achieve, but also making sure that we're really speaking to the challenges around people, incentives, kind of the structural environment in which these tools and websites are deployed.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those who are calling in remotely. I couldn't, echo more the challenges that we have around data, and if to the extent that that's the cornerstone of increasing information, the reliability, you talked about completeness, but, the reliability, is it up to date and accurate? And then also, is it accessible? And can it easily be utilized are key challenges. Then moving into the interoperability space where you have data from one data set and another, are they talking to each other? So I think that those, you've covered the data challenges really, really well. So maybe I'll focus a little bit more on some other areas. And I will just also say that my background coming into this space is largely within the context of USAID's Grand Challenges for Development program. In case you haven't already heard, we have our 12th Grand Challenge. It's focusing on countering transnational corruption. Administrator Power spoke about the first activity that we have under that Grand Challenge, the Powering a Just Energy Transition. Green Minerals Challenge, which is open for applications now. So my remarks come from this Grand Challenge perspective in terms of how do we foster innovation and collaboration and move beyond just having gadgets or widgets or fancy tools or amazing data dashboards that aren't fundamentally utilized. So in that vein, I think, and you touched on this as well, is that tech is a tool, or data are tools to be able to achieve a purpose, right? And so we can't technically solve our way out of a fundamentally human, behavioral, social issue. And so thinking about what are the incentives, where is their influence, and being really thoughtful about who are the end users, how will information or technology be utilized is going to be key. And so I won't go into the approaches or the solutions yet, but I think that we need to increasingly think in that space. And then the last piece that I'll say on this is that I think that there's also a real need to be thinking about, when we have tech tools, how do we do no harm, and how do we also be thoughtful about the fact that every solution that we come up with, others can come up with ways to take advantage of them. And so very quickly, the example that I can't claim credit for this, but a great colleague of mine had raised was e-procurement, right? So we come up with this digitization, it's more efficient, this is great, it's transparent, we put the information out there, procurements are going to be run efficiently. I won't say which country it was in, but you'll get a sense of the region. At the same time, you talk about the humans behind the tech. It's very easy to create a password to log into a procurement system, or to submit a bid for a procurement system, a code that's a combination of English and Cyrillic letters, and only your uncle or only your cousin knows when is it in English and when is it a Cyrillic letter, so that you have an e-system that's accepting procurement bids. It's public, it's out there, it's transparent, but you have one one applicant who can successfully actually submit their data because they know the code, because the person working behind it's given it. So I think that the other component of things is also thinking about how do we ensure that we don't just sit on our laurels once we have the good tech out there.
Great. Well, I wanted to definitely repeat some of the points that have just been made, especially the one about incentives. So at the Center for International Private Enterprise, we focus on emerging markets, and we focus on finding anti-corruption solutions that involve the private sector. And in doing so, there's an absolute need for the incentives to be aligned, because we're talking about markets, we're talking about profits, we're talking about sustainability, not just in the environmental sense, but in the how is this organization going to survive after we leave sense. And so we're looking for ways that we can help build things that after we leave, they stick around. And that means aligning with market incentives. It means aligning with demand. And so I think the challenges that we encounter abroad are, how can we find solutions that use technology that are going to fit the local context? There's going to be a market for that. There's going to be people saying, I want that, I need that, I'm willing to pay for that. And then you have leaders that are homegrown that represent that. This isn't a externally imposed solution. And so just a quick example, I was listening to C-SPAN radio the other day on what was probably the most boring topic, which was there was too many people going to national parks, which is a great problem to have. But in the last few years, the increase of people in national parks is like 40, 50%. And in Yellowstone, they had this problem where a left-hand turn that was not a right-of-way was causing lines of like 2 or 3 miles of cars. And they were looking at solutions that would take 12 to 18 months to build a new, workaround bridge. And it was going to be a huge expense, and it was going to take a super long time. And then a local employee said, what if we just made it a 4-way stop? And they did, and it solved the problem. And sometimes the technology solution that actually fits isn't the big bridge. It isn't the massive, blockchain-powered tech solution that takes millions of dollars. It's the tech equivalent of a 4-way stop. And that's going to fit the local environment. It's going to fit what the government can pay for. It's going to fit what the local users can interact with and know how to use. And so I think that's the challenge, is being willing to maybe set our egos aside, our buzzword technologies aside, and build the 4-way stop, because that's what the developing market needs, and that's what they're going to buy.
Can I just expand on that? So I think I like that 4-way stop of tech. And just to say, what we've seen as another challenge, but to think of what are other solutions that make sense, looking at the institutional components. So, we did a West African assessment of public procurement there. And as we know, 15% of GDP per capita of sub-Saharan Africa is through public procurement. And we looked at West Africa, in Guinea specifically, only 13% of approved contracts met all legal requirements, right? We have situations where, talking about small and medium-sized businesses, lots of instances where payments were delivered more than 90 days, right, after an invoice was due. So we're seeing cash flow issues with these small and medium-sized businesses who are trying to grow. We heard about procurement officers who aren't receiving training. So these are all different avenues that matter just as much as the tech avenue, right? And these are kind of these quote-unquote simpler solutions that can have a big impact when we look at where to invest, right?
I sometimes think that thinking about the humans behind the tech, it's kind of as though we say to ourselves, like, listen, as practitioners, we haven't figured out this anti-corruption problem yet, but maybe if we throw some tech at it, we'll figure this out and we can take a bit of a backseat. But what I've heard from you is a lot about context, about not imposing the humanness and making sure that it actually is designed for the utility of humans, but also the sustainability of solutions, because I've also seen often grants going towards solutions that are really involved, that need server maintenance and the staff and all sorts of things that become really difficult to maintain after that project cycle, like when that money runs out. And so the idea of this 4-way stop type of approach really resonates, because it means that, it's something that's not going to cost money in perpetuity to maintain. Having heard all of these challenges you see with adopting new technology, I'd like to switch gears in a solutions-oriented way towards some of the opportunities you all have seen over the last few years, and would love to hear some examples from your work.
So I can start just to say that in terms of opportunities, one of my perspectives is the subnational space can be a really ripe opportunity for investment. So at Development Gateway, we've developed an open contracting portal that displays public procurement data, right? And we, encountered Makueni County in Kenya, right, that had the government there and the cabinet at the county level. There was a big push politically to curb corruption. And so when we, it was a really great alignment in terms of being able to work with them, being able to solve for their needs through this dashboard, which shows different stages of the tender process. And it was, for them, it was a win politically because, of course, it aligned with their incentives. And what's interesting is that open contracting portal, it's now a digital public good, which is very exciting. But just to say, I think the subnational space is really ripe for opportunity. I would say in terms of how we talk about these, interventions, or whether they're tech or non-tech, being able to speak with that business case, making an economic case for what we're trying to achieve for the results that we're seeing. So just as a quick example, the Makueni Open Contracting Portal, after a year of using it, what we heard at the cabinet level is that the transportation department saved $250,000, and the water department saved $1.6 million out of a total annual budget of $8 million. So this is where, yes, in that particular case, we had political alignment, but even if we're entering in spaces and now we're in discussions with other counties, with other spaces in the subnational area, where being able to talk about that economic case can be really critical. And then just my last point on opportunity, that capacity building, the conversations, I mentioned the civil society organizations we work with before on, talking to them about why procurement data matters. What's interesting is that a local Kenyan CSO that we've worked with, Uriah, they were able to go into the portal and find 30 different projects that were stalled and then raise it to the cabinet level to say, hey, what's the status of these projects? Guess what? Those projects are all moving forward. So that's an example of where the conversation ongoing about what does this actually mean in terms of accountability, in terms of improving service delivery, and seeing a lot of success there. So I would say those are different opportunities in the space.
Andrea, I'm going to jump in with a quick question for you. Do you have an example of where there was really limited alignment and where you had to make a really big push to get people to utilize the tool?
Yes, and we left, to make a long story short. Yeah.
Sure, no, and that's great. I mean, those are impressive results, and I think actually, yes, and we left is a great response, right? Let's not keep forcing our solutions forward. And so I think I'm going to hit on, several points that we raised in the problem identification section as well, and really focusing on, I think, when USAID's Grand Challenges first started, I think there was a lot of focus on the power of financial resources. So we had grants to reward innovative solvers who are coming up with innovative solutions. We had partnerships that were focused on our financial contributions and leveraging resources financially. And I think over the last, when we get to the 12th Grand Challenge, one of the key lessons that we've learned is the money is important, but it's such a small component of our work, right? And so it's also about building in to our challenges when we're looking for solutions, building in identification of end users from the very beginning. Who wants to use this tool? Where are their incentives to use it? It's about collaboration and networks, and not just pulling in the financial resources of our partners, but the breadth and depth of the technical expertise they have. And so for this Grand Challenge, for the Jet Minerals Challenge, we're really blessed to have Amazon, BHP Foundation, Fiona's in the room here, Chandler Foundation as our operational partners who are going to bring a lot of the heft behind the work that we're doing. But then we also have a host of broader partnerships and engagements that we have. We have Fortune 500 companies who've said, who have mineral supply chains, who've said, hey, if there's a solution that comes out of this that might be relevant for our household name company to use, we'll pilot it in our supply chain. We'll work with your solvers to test it. We've had others that you may use on your phone regularly who said, we have a lot of brain power. We'll get our engineers, we'll get our AI folks, we'll get our solvers to engage and work with your team, your solvers, to help them, advance their solution so that it's not alone. And so I think one of the really key components of this is, and this goes to a point that Ben had made earlier, it's the tech is a tool, it's a component of things, but it's really about integrating it into the system and figuring out, what is needed. And so I think that that's a lot of our focus, is building in from the outset an expectation that we need to know who the end user is, and we need to know where the incentives line to be able to actually, use that solution. And the other thing is that we're not tech focused for the Grand Challenge, right? In terms of innovation, it could be a tool, a technology, or an approach, because sometimes it is a four-way stop. Even if that's the second best park, national park in Montana, where I'm from.
Well, I think all the national parks are great. So I really good points that have been made. I think one of the opportunities that we've seen is that sometimes our own, we're an NGO, we're based in DC, we have a team, we have team management struggles and tools that we use. Sometimes capacity building is just sharing, what works best for us is this. This is how we do, team meetings. This is how we do shared documents. This is how we do, operationalizing our best practices and making them more effective. And then helping the teams in the local context start practicing some of the things that you've been doing well, or that has worked well for you. In one of our projects, we're helping grassroots organizers in places like Ghana follow up with local government and subnational government and say, hey, how's this project going? Hey, what's the status of this project? And sometimes it's just, hey, do you have a tracker for that? Do you use a shared document? Do you have a Facebook group? Do you push things out to your network? Are you expanding your network? Are you involving the community? Who are the government or the community leaders? Are they talking to you? Do you have visibility? Do you have a WhatsApp group where everybody's there and everybody has each other's contact numbers? Sometimes it's the simple stuff. Yesterday I was in a session where we had Mauricio from Ecuador just saying, honestly, we've just been realizing we just need to go back to the basics. And I think opportunities to use technology can sometimes leverage the technology that isn't going anywhere. Google and its set of applications that are free for use if you have a Gmail account, they're not going anywhere. Facebook, it's not going anywhere. Start with those tools that in an emerging market, with one free account, you can gain access to that suite of tools. And start there. Start using those tools and start operationalizing best practices like regular follow-up, shared documents, trackers, and maybe the best practices methodology documents, whether it's a manual, a how-to, and start just practicing that over and over and over again. In 2017, CIPE was in a country, the Gambia, where there was almost no civil society capacity. And when we went in there, there was like a handful of individuals who were highly motivated. And what the CIPE program officer, which was not me, did was just bring them all together into a room and help them form their own organization. And after like 20 video calls with these various NGO groups, we helped form the Anti-Corruption Coalition Gambia, which is now a very, very high capacity and very productive coalition of anti-corruption organizers in the Gambia, in a place where a dictator had run and ruled with an iron fist for over 20 years. And so sometimes it's just starting with the basics, starting with the tools that we all have access to, and just consistently training and working and sharing those best practices until they, CIPE is no longer helping support with grants, that organization, but they have other grants because they learned proposal writing from us. They learned how to find other donors that could support them after we left. And so I think sometimes it's just starting with the basics and the tech tools that we all have access to already, and then letting them move up from there.
I really like the practicality of what you all are mentioning here, and especially that, we're not always thinking big tools, and we're not always thinking grand corruption at the national level. There are very many things that can be done at the subnational level and can be done to catalyze locally led or locally bred, rather, solutions to challenges. We're going to switch gears to what we're learning in a moment, but I wanted to share a little bit about some work that the Accountability Lab has been doing with CIPE, in that we've been running with the support of INL under the ASSET program, an initiative called Hack Corruption, where we're building cohorts of young people regionally, starting with the Southern African region earlier this year, to essentially develop tech tools that helps in anti-corruption in their specific context. And what we are really learning there is that it's not just about getting a bunch of technologists in a room, but rather that we need a multi-pronged approach, that we need to partner up technologists with people who really understand public policy, with people who are activists and know what's happening on the ground and what's being called for. But more than that, also people who understand the processes in government, the physical, how does the procurement committee work? In other words, how do we build a tool that will be used by them because it fits their system? And one of the ways we're trying to bridge that gap is actually also to get government officials to come in and reverse pitch challenges that they need solved, so that the solutions we build have a higher likelihood of being used by them. And so these issues of utility and creating incentive remains, but I'd love to hear from your end what you're doing and what you're learning, more importantly, because I think as we embrace emerging technologies and as we try new approaches, we don't have it figured out. I certainly don't have it figured out after this week, because I've just learned about a whole lot of new things. So I'd love to hear what you're doing.
So sure, I can start with still very much learning, but yeah, I think in terms of what we're learning, and I'll talk a little bit about buy-in, if that's okay, just to say that when we talk about the importance of buy-in and sustainability, the example I gave in East Africa was interesting because we had, as I mentioned, political will and buy-in from leadership, which matters quite a bit. What we found was when we were working with the people who will be using the website very frequently, the procurement officers, there was a lot of resistance. And that was really, something that we worked together with them on, and what helped was doing co-design sessions where we sit together and we say, hey, this is how we're thinking of this looking. Is this easy to use? Can you find what you need? And then iterating. But just to say that we also found that one of the big drivers of their adopting the website was the fact that we were able to show how generating a report that would be shown up at the national level could be done automatically. That saved a ton of manual work. And so that was a big incentive and a big level up in terms of their engagement and their buy-in. So I'd say we're learning that. And just to say how important country context is, right? So what works, in Senegal might not work in Tanzania and all sorts of different contexts. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
So I think I touched on this a little bit in my last response in terms of learning of expanding our approaches to go far beyond rewarding innovation to actually supporting and empowering innovation, which I think is really key. So it goes beyond, can we develop a tool, but or have an innovative approach, but really how do we build an ecosystem and how do we build a network of a community, a system that pulls in from the end user to solvers, and creating relationships amongst the solver network, not only with the other partners but with each other, and then beyond that, right? So there's a lot that we can learn from one sector, approaching this in one sector towards another, and sometimes we can be really siloed. And we've gotten great response from a lot of colleagues in the environment sector about the jet minerals challenge, which is amazing because it's a very important topic, which is why we started with it. I would, query how many of the solutions that we'll get in the mineral space wouldn't be useful in health commodity supply chains or in humanitarian assistance. So I think that that's, a lot of it. And then I'll put in 2 plugs because I can't synthesize these learnings in a, this type of setting fully, but USAID did do a meta evaluation of the first 10 grand challenges, and there are so many nuggets in that report in terms of thinking about this, a lot of which I summarized before in terms of thinking about the end users, building in sustainability mechanisms, those key pieces. And then we've also done a state of innovation analysis, specifically with looking at combating transnational corruption, to be able to try to identify where there are existing innovations and where there are gaps, barriers, and opportunities. And I think it's interesting because one of the key places is, as we're talking about, is really the behavioral component of things, the human aspect. And frighteningly, a colleague put into ChatGPT, what are innovative solutions to addressing corruption? And it hit on what I would see as 3 of the main points that we've talked about today were what it produced. And so I think that we really need to be also thinking in that space about what we can learn and how do we keep innovating.
And for those of you who don't know, ChatGPT is this amazing new AI that you can create your own account for free and ask it any question, and it will search the internet for and politely answer your question. We've been looking at how it can maybe write half of our proposals. But anyway, you should check it out. It's really cool. Building off of what was said, end users are people, and people are really fickle. Sometimes people will have really weird resistances to things, and then the breakthroughs will be just as surprising. So I'm now working at a nonprofit that's funded by Congress and departments of state and other governments. But in my past career life, I was an IT salesman, and I was also a salesman for a variety of home and yard services. And when I was in Tennessee trying to go door to door and sell pest control, there were people who would come to me and say, I don't care about the spiders. I don't care about the ants. I don't care about the wasps. What can you do about the moles in my backyard? They're making these little trails everywhere, and I hate them. And they would tell me about that Bill Murray show from the 1990s where he would go to town on the golf course to try to kill the moles. And if I could find a solution to that, he'd get the whole package. And that whole package was like his entire yard and like 25 different pests that would be taken care of. And sometimes our anti-corruption solutions have like 25 different types of anti-corruption that we're going to solve. But the end user, or maybe the buyer, doesn't care about the 25. They just care about one. And if we can just find that one thing that they need solved, then they'll get the whole system. And so I think that's one of the things that I've been learning as well, is that is true in local markets. When we were doing this hackathon in South Africa, we tried to get reverse pitches, because if you have a government official that is frustrated about the way that we have to build reports every week, and it's super time consuming, and this solution that will also make it harder for corruption to occur also solves my inefficiency problem, then I'm totally on board. And so I think just remembering that our end users are human, our end users are fickle, and sometimes there is a specific solution that if you can provide that to them, they will turn around and say, I want it. How can we close this? How can we make this happen? I guess the second thing I wanted to bring up, which is a little bit different, is the importance of diversity, and the importance of diversity in kind of a different way than we traditionally think about it. In my development degree, which was kind of when I switched careers, I went and did a master's in development. We talked about how inclusive growth is the most exciting type of growth, because the gains aren't concentrated into people who already have, but the growth is shared with those who don't have. And so that 1% GDP growth, or that 5% GDP growth, it's shared across the different income groups, as opposed to being concentrated in those income groups that are already privileged. That's how we traditionally think about diversity, but diversity also is a way to be more persuasive. When we did this hackathon, we worked really hard to make the teams diverse. And I think it was something like, was it 40%? Yeah. It was 40% women that showed up at this hackathon to try to create IT tools that would address corruption problems across 6 Southern African countries. And what you got were a diversity of problem solution imaginers in a room where they are able to come up with, I think it's just much more likely for whole of society solutions to be imagined when you have a much more society representative group in the room. And then when you get to the point of presenting your solutions, you have this diverse team that is able to then go before, media or a government office or another business that might, buy what they're developing and fund it. And you have this diverse team that's representing this idea. And I think that makes a difference because, maybe you like me was like, should I go get a vaccine? And your mom says, go get a vaccine, and you don't. And President Biden says, go get a vaccine, and you don't. But then your grandma calls you and says, so when you're getting your vaccine? And you're like, tomorrow. Because when your grandma tells you, you're persuaded. And sometimes that's how it works too. When you have, like Delia Ferreira said, when you have under 30s, when you have women, when you have people who you haven't heard from before standing before you saying, you really should do this, that can be persuasive in a way that maybe before it wasn't.
And can I just say that exactly what you were saying at the ideation phase, what we've seen the exact element in terms of the importance of bringing many voices to the table when we're doing the design and implementation, right? So when we're developing the tools and we're stopping and having those sessions to say, is this what you wanted, right? We find people, I'm thinking of one example in South Africa. One of the individuals who was very key in these kind of co-development sessions, she's the biggest proponent of the website, right? She is telling the deputy director of health when she met with him how important the website is, how relevant it is to policy. So just to say that, we get a lot of enthusiasm when there is that ownership of the idea and the implementation, right? It's not a US-based org coming in with their ideas. This is very much driven by the individuals who are using the information.
I think there's such an incredibly valuable point here about looking beyond the end user to also like who's selling it. That cannot be overstated, and I think sometimes that's a critical mistake we make if there's if we're going to sell this to a government with a diversity of people, we can't send in one person who doesn't resonate with them or who doesn't speak the language that's going to be understandable. And I think that's a challenge to all of us in the space to make sure that the person who's trying to convince, is creating the incentives, needs to also really resonate with those on the ground who we see as the end users ultimately. I want to open up a bit of time for Q&A. I have very many questions I can ask, but we also have a good group of people in the room. And actually, before we do that, since this is a hybrid event, I'd just like to ask our colleagues from, we don't have anything online yet? Okay, so if you are tuned in online, now is a good time to please drop some questions in the chat, but I will open it up to those of you in the room to please come up to the mic and pose a question to the speakers.
Hello, good morning. Maybe. Okay. I was curious, so you were talking about design with human in mind, and I wanted to see if you could speak a little bit about the tension between building with the existing system in mind and then building with the digital native in mind. Thanks.
Do we want to jump into that one, whoever feels so moved?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we would talk about in South Africa was that the young people who were there, just to give you a brief outline of what it was 100 people. They were pretty much all under 30. There were maybe one or two over 30. They weren't just technologists, but some of them were like business majors or marketing majors who were excited about kind of being part of teams that would come up with ideas, but maybe being more on the marketing side. And then you had your kind of your AI and your coders, and it was really interesting to see these groups come together. And what you saw were these young people in Southern Africa were digital natives. They had grown up, especially the ones that were like 22, 23, in a world that was social media, that was internet, that was YouTube. And lots of times, government officials, government bureaucrats are not that. And that is true, I think, in any country, as it is in these Southern African countries. And so I think when you're building solutions that is going to work with both, I think you have to start with those who are the decision makers. The decision makers are generally those who are already in government, who are already administering these departments, providing these government services, providing these government projects and funding and budgets. And you have to start with what exists, but then you have to figure out what their pain points are. Like, what frustrates you about this? And you have to listen. When Steve Jobs took over Apple again in 1997, he spent 6 months just listening. He went around to all the departments at Apple, and he just listened to what they were doing. He went around and talked to all the major customers of Apple products and asked them what did they like most about Apple. He went around and talked to the executives and said, what do you think makes Apple a great company? And then at that very first 1997, you can find it on YouTube, that very first presentation, he kind of presented to Apple who Apple was, who their customers were, what they believed in themselves, what they liked the most about themselves. And then he came up with a couple of ideas of how they could just keep doing what they were doing best, but better. And I think when a civil society organization that is anti-corruption just sees government as the enemy and just wants to just like push it in their face every time they're in a meeting, you're a government official and you're doing it wrong and you're a bad actor and you're corrupt and you have all these ways that you could be improving but you're not. That doesn't necessarily get very far. But if you can start by going, often the government solutions, the government services are the only institution in a country that is trying to build roads, that is trying to build services that help the poor, trying to build schools and clinics. And if you can start by going, you're doing work that benefits people. What are your problems? And if we can help civil society groups ask those questions, what are your problems? Then it's going to be easier for these government officials to participate in these reverse pitches, where they show up and they're willing to talk to those civil society groups and say, let me tell you what my problems are. Let me tell you what my frustrations are. We're also frustrated that this clinic hasn't come out, or that it's stuck in construction still, or that these roads haven't been built, or that the contractor hasn't responded. We're also frustrated because of these pain points that we have. And then you can bring in the digital natives and say, is there a technology solution that can solve that pain point, that can resolve that issue, or can speed it up, or can simplify it, make it one click instead of 20. And then those digital natives are like, oh yeah, of course, there's a way we can totally make that happen. And then those digital natives can apply their skills to the problems that are the hard problems, that are the sticky problems. That's one insight that I think we've seen.
Yeah, and if I can talk a little bit more about what you were, what you were ending on, which is the building of the tools. So when I think about your question, I think about designing for different audiences, right? And that's key. And what I've found, and when we do assessments before we design and build some of these technical tools, we aim to talk to a diverse range of stakeholders. And when I say diverse, that means government officials in different ministries, right, rather than the ones that you would assume always would be interested in a certain sector. We also look at civil society and academics. And what's interesting is I remember conversations where I was in the room asking these interviews, what data do you need? How do you use it? How do you use data now? What are the challenges you have? And we talked to a professor who says, I want to be able to drill down. I want to know how a research study was conducted, for example. What was the sample size? When we talked to the government official, one of the government officials, they said, well, I don't want to drill down. I want to come away with the story of what I need to know. In fact, graphs scare me. And if we're honest, maybe graphs scare a lot of us. And what was great about that honesty and that clarity is when we built our dashboard, what we decided to do was build on insights and stories. So it's very qualitative, and guess what? We have a drill down area where for the academics, for individuals who prefer to see that detail, they can go there, but the default view is getting those messages across. So just to say the audience can really guide those kinds of what ends up being the whole look and feel of what you end up interacting with.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think that we take a very broad perspective on who is the audience for the tools and who ultimately has a role to play in addressing corruption. I know that oftentimes we focus on the role of the government, and particularly local government, but all of us have roles that we can play. And so sometimes you'll be developing, you can have digital natives who are developing tools or technologies for very high-tech and sophisticated companies or end users, or that's very appropriate. And in some instances, we might recognize that, okay, this is a digital native is designing a very elaborate approach that's not going to fit with who ultimately would need to use it. And that's also okay. I mean, I think we can also support and identify and find solutions that the world's not ready for yet, and have some level of focus on that, because ultimately the goal is then to help us advance where we're going. And unearthing those and knowing these solutions, even if they're not feasible to be implemented at this point in time, also gives us a lot of information about where we might want to be going and what types of digital literacy or basic infrastructure do we need to be able to harness the power of the innovation and the solutions as well.
Thank you. Do we have another question coming up here?
I would also say solutions too, or thoughts, because I think a lot of what we're saying, a lot of people in this room could have sat on this panel equally well. So
Absolutely.
Also happy to hear your experiences.
Awesome, thank you. My name is Titus Gitonga. I work with Transparency International Kenya. So mine is just to share our experiences in terms of so for instance, there are a lot of bureaucracies with governments adopting or accepting to take up solutions, tech solutions. And sometimes you understand because of the bureaucracies involved in the adoption of such technologies. So what sometimes we've done is to create an appetite. So for instance, you have to create a solution. So for an example would be empowering citizens to monitor use of public resources within, for instance, public primary schools and health centers. And if you're able to get the data from government, so on budgets, expenditures, and how the monies are coming in, and then you're able to move a platform that citizens now can get information on how funding within their local schools or health centers is going on, and create an appetite where government now sees that as a platform where citizens are able to engage on budget participatory at the local level. And to some extent, you see them now saying that, because we had tried that with an app called Action for Transparency, and you see that the county government said that much as your app is good, but because it was having information on education and health, we want a specific one just for the health sector, and with the same sort of features that you're presenting. So sometimes as civil society, you have to go out of your way to create a platform where sometimes in the initial stages, government does not willingly take it up, but you have to have resources to manage it and sustain it outside of government until that appetite and acceptance is created. But also when you're dealing with so like high-level corruption, when you're trying to build web networks of procurement or such like things, you may look outside where you're working, for instance, with journalists that are able to work on investigative journalism and therefore create platforms that are more aligned to them identifying stories to connect in terms of how the corruption networks are there, but also have a leverage of how you're going to get information from government platforms. So having the open governance platforms on, for instance, procurement information, and then using that information for your own platforms that can expose some of the things, the underlying issues that you're facing. So I think those are some of the examples I could give in terms of what has managed to get some successes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and this is exactly what drives the conversation forward. Also hearing from you all in the audience what you've done and what you've learned. I'm going to make it really easy for you to add a story or ask a question, and I'll just come around with the roaming mic. So, yeah, you'll come up. Thank you, Eric.
My name's Eric Robinson with the Africa Program at the National Endowment for Democracy. My question, one, I'd like to say thank you for saying something about processes. And it's critically important for people to understand the how things happen in their space. You want to, as a young person or an older person, to understand more about parliamentary process than the parliamentarians in your country. You want to have a clear idea, whatever space you're in, how power moves around that space. And I think conveying that is critically important at these things like the hackathons. I have two questions or comments. One is there a conversation, or are you inserting some of the normative value components to why some of this work is important when 100 people are coming together at the hackathon? I find that in some of the work we do, whether it's with political parties, where we're training parliamentarians, sometimes in that process and that teaching, we get lost and don't continue to hammer away at the norms and values that are underpinning some of that, or supposed to underpin that process. And I would say that right now, globally, it's probably more important to keep a focus on those norms and values, because I think right now we're trying to reimagine what those norms and values are. We're being asked questions about democracy, about democratic norms and values around the world, and rightly so. We have to reimagine what our message is. When you're marketing that, it's no longer, we just can't rest on our laurels if they were ever there in some way. And people are demanding more about how it's going to deliver and what it means to them. So I think keeping that going in this space is critically important in the technical space. And the other piece is just learning. You can monitor something, you can have a tool that monitors something, but billions of dollars have been spent on reports and modules that are all available online. And I think the more that people who are digital natives can slow down and take the time to do that reading and learning, knowledge is still power. And I think continuing to convey that message in the spaces, to slow down and take time to do the reading about the information that the space that you're monitoring, will make you so powerful, and it'll just magnify the technology that you're using.
Thank you so much, Eric. Would anyone like to add to that or respond?
I think kind of combining some of the comments made in those last two comments, and thank you so much for asking those questions and sharing those insights. On the question of how do we inculcate kind of the values and the norms, and I think to connect with what Andrea said, I think we have to start with stories. In a lot of countries, you have a dominant narrative about government or about how your community works. There are kind of frustrations that everyone just repeats over and over and over again. It's like a mantra. And they're self-reinforcing because you see more evidence that reinforces that, that narrative. And then something needs to come along and kind of change your narrative. And that usually means you need a story, something that relates to you, that gives you a new way of seeing the facts before you. And I think the journalist that the previous question or comment mentioned, journalists and participatory solutions that involve citizens coming together and talking and community building, I think are really important. some of the solutions that came out of our the hackathon were the idea of apps sort of like Uber or Airbnb, where local communities are able to provide feedback on what they see happening at their local government level, giving reviews on government projects as they come down the pipe and they're implemented, and giving feedback and having, like, through an app, a forum, a public forum to be able to talk about, the success or failures of local community projects. And I think that can kind of start us on the process of community building. In the discussion that I had with Cheri and Accountability Lab, we talked about how really what we want to leave behind after the hackathon is not just a bunch of widgets or tools that may or may not be picked up and implemented, but a community of people who still have connections to each other and that are united by their common interest in stronger institutions that get rid of corruption and that strengthen local communities' ability to solve problems. If we leave behind stronger communities that problem solve, then we've done something amazing. And just in the lobby of the hotel in South Africa where we were having this hackathon, I had this conversation with a leader of a team who he was the only in-person. His entire rest of his team were all virtual because they weren't able to come to South Africa. So it was just him representing his team of 6, with 5 online and him in person. And I was telling him about how in the United States where I live, there are things like traffic barriers that they get set up because there's like a local neighborhood gathering where they're like, at night, teenagers go driving so fast down our street, we need to do something about it. And so they get in contact with local government and they put up a barrier. And how that local organization of communities that get together, speak, organize, and find solutions to these problems is like why so many problems get solved. And I would ask them, like, so I asked this young man, so have you ever imagined what would happen if your community would get together and think about your problems and your local government issues and would suggest on a regular basis, maybe once a month, this is what we've decided needs to be changed? And he looked at me like, wow, that's amazing. That would be amazing. We never do that. I've never even heard of that. And so these things that are like the air we breathe in developed countries where our local communities get together and we solve problems. Sometimes that's what we can leave behind. Maybe that can be the norm that we can leave behind, the values we can get behind, is we have a community, you have a community, and your community is powerful. That community, when you get together and you participate and you find solutions that everyone agrees with, that can help change bit by bit your local community and the development in your community, the opportunities for growth in your community, and so forth.
Just speaking to both points, I want to say a few things very quickly. One is about the theme of trust, and I hear what you're saying in terms of local ownership, but also when we look at these anti-corruption tools, of course, what we're trying to do in many ways is foster trust in the processes, right? That they are working well and that there's systems in place to have formal redress complaints, right, if needed. I wanted to expand on a quote here. We need to do the reading on how power moves in a given context. Absolutely. And I think to add to that on the tech side, we need to understand, again, the institutional, how power is flowing, but also we have open source tools and digital public goods that get us going on the tech front. So in other words, in the same vein, I just want to double down on, there's work already done on lots of these aspects. So we don't need, our individual organizations don't need, we need to be redoubling work that has been documented and exists for the broader community. And then, with the prior example about the success that Action for Transparency has had, I thought that was interesting. And I wanted to touch on beneficial ownership data because we've been talking a lot about public procurement data, or I've been talking a lot about public procurement data. And beneficial ownership is, of course, very interesting. And I wanted to give an example from Nigeria, the 2020 CAMA Act, the Companies and Allied Matters Act. fairly recent, that requires disclosure not just of beneficial owners, but also persons with significant control in an entity. So it goes beyond kind of the beneficial owner requirement, and there's also no provisions for politically exposed people. And I talked to our West Africa regional lead about this law, and she talked about how, this is in process, and this is going forward in Nigeria. And she said, again, emphasizing how important country context is and what you're releasing and how that's going to be used. She says, you can do that in Nigeria. You can potentially do that in Senegal. But if you release that information in DRC, you might be starting a civil war. And that's a very frank quote from her, but I think it really speaks to what are we, let's be wide-eyed about the reality of the situation and the context that we're working in, and what is appropriate and what makes sense at what stage.
Yeah, I think, Eric, your remarks resonate so much because when I think about the work we were doing on the hackathons, it's not even just about the tools, but these gatherings of spaces where people feel like they can use their skills to participate is equally important. It is the normative and the feeling of participation, especially in countries where people may have become apathetic or hopeless around corruption issues, right? And like building a network of people who feel like they want to re-engage, they can do something, and maybe the bit of gold about it is not even the tool that comes out of it, but the network that you get out of it of people who are willing to think together and work on the same values to counter corruption. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question or share an experience? We have one online. Perfect. Would you mind reading it out?
So that's a question from Cindy. She's referring to a research in Kenya, and she's actually talking about the social aspect, or the social aspect of fighting corruption. And what she's asking she's asking, so in the context of Kenya, a research has shown that the youth believes that fighting corruption is not in their interest to start with. Corruption helps them. So she's asking, in that context, how do you actually make the youth use tech to fight corruption? How do you bridge that, convincing people not just to use tech, but also to fight corruption with tech?
I don't pretend to have an easy answer to this, but to bridge that and the last question around a slight variation on the norms question, I think there's been a lot of research in this. You have to think about why don't they think it's useful, right? And so what is happening in society that has created that perception? Sometimes it can be a misperception that corruption's actually more pervasive than it is, and you can actually use the data to say, oh, you think everybody's paying a bribe? Actually, it's only 1 out of 4 people, and you can demyth some of the commonality, for example. In other instances, there are social sanctions. Going back to the norms piece of it, it could be that it benefits because more of the youth are affiliated, like the youth that are being engaged are in families where their family members have jobs that allow them to collect bribes, and so that's part of the system. And so I think it's part of what we need to get at, and this is going back to the earlier point on norms, is really I think for us, our focus is on understanding the norms of the communities that we're working with, and where are there places where we might want to be. We need to do work up front to be able to shift some of those norms, to be able to debunk myths, or to be able to identify what are the barriers that are driving the attitude or the belief that fighting corruption actually undermines or doesn't serve the youth. I think that's the first step. And in some instances, I think, as Andrea really accurately flagged, we have to do this with a do no harm perspective. In some instances, what we would have to change would actually have greater risks to populations, and we need to be cognizant of that. So it's not always going to be the right time or the right place to engage as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to say, you're hitting on points that I was thinking about as we were listening to the question, but just to share, this space is so hungry for happy, right, like uplifting stories, for positive use cases. And I think Accountability Lab does such a great job of showing successes, right? That when we focus on that, that is so much more generative than, kind of beating the drum of corruption cases. Then there's a space for that, 100%. But just to say, especially when we're looking at increasing engagement, using hope as a driver can be very powerful.
Yeah, totally agree that there's so much hunger for like change in these countries, and like it just makes me think of that Hamilton line where it's like the brother was ready to beg, steal, or borrow for change, for something new to happen in his life. And I think in Kenya that might be the case, where people see, where am I going to get the resources? How am I going to rise up? How am I going to change? And they might see that, the only way I'm ever going to get out of this, this self-repetitive system that is, my community, is if maybe I find a way to get corruption to work for me. Because that's maybe what they've seen are the success stories of people who, maybe steal their way to success, or they find the clever approach that gets them out. And what we need to provide in our work is an alternative solution that isn't that. And it was exciting to stand before those 100 people and tell them like 5 of these teams, up to 5 of these teams will receive a grant from the US State Department that will allow you to, substantially build this tool out. You will have the finance, you will have the resources that you need, that you couldn't get locally from the US State Department. And then when you are trying to find buyers and supporters, you can say, we have a grant from US State Department to build this tool. And that can give you street cred in front of government officials saying like, this is for real. And I think when we do these sorts of capacity building and helping grow and provide new avenues for kind of breaking out of what they've been doing in the past to young people, then that can generate hope. That can generate, well, maybe there's a way to do this that isn't, dishonest, that will create something good. And so I think we can start by doing what we can to provide those opportunities to them.
A big thank you to our online participant for that question, and maybe just also encouragement to stay curious about how we might reframe the conversation from anti-corruption to something that is more hopeful and drives enthusiasm, like maybe it's a service delivery question, right? Or a healthcare specific question, and reframing it sometimes also builds some excitement. Do we have any other questions? I think you were first and then behind you. Perfect.
Good morning, everyone. Talking about the buying component, you were mentioning this analogy of moles in the yard. But sometimes kids like the moles in the yard, to make the analogy of the users that will, in the end, get the benefit of this corruption as a business model. So going back to that component, what were the challenges in the change management perspective to get the systems to stay in place and people not fight against it from the inside of the institutions you help migrate to digital systems?
So I think there are probably, out of every 10 possible anti-corruption solutions that could be imagined using tech, probably 9 of them would fail for that exact reason, that the users don't want it, or they'll resist it. I was talking yesterday to someone at an event, and they were talking about how lawyers reached out to him to create an AI-driven system to solve this complex, finding uncovering the web of companies and networks and so forth. And in 3 days, their software solved that problem. And the lawyers never called them back because it was so easy that it was going to put them all out of business. And so they didn't want a solution that was too good. And if you ever watched that show, Amazing Grace, about getting rid of the slave trade in the United Kingdom, it wasn't until a majority of the MPs were no longer economically tied, their economic interests were no longer tied to the slave trade, that the majority could actually vote against it. They all believed it was wrong, but their economic interests were tied to its continuation. And so I think there are going to be a lot of aspects of corruption in countries where there's too many people who are tied to it economically, their interests are too tied to its continuation, for people to accept a solution that would get rid of it. And so you have to be aware of that. That's why aligning the incentives is so important. You have to start with those areas in which the incentives are aligned. And so I think that's why the reverse pitching is so important. You have to ask government, so what solutions are you looking for? And find the overlap between where government has pain and has things that they're frustrated with, and implementing a solution using technology also makes it harder to corrupt.
Yeah, I would just add to that, I think absolutely finding where the incentives do align. I would say three things. One, find where the incentives do align. Two, explore if there are alternative incentives that are in conflict that you can leverage to shift the incentives that are barriers to the solution. And so you can use an example you use the example of even with your grandmother in COVID, right? You might have a disincentive to actually go to a physical location and take the time out, but when you have social pressure and expectation from a loved one, that can shift your incentive, and we have that in the corruption space as well. Let's be clear, there are a lot of really strong incentives for corruption, particularly if we're talking about grand corruption and kleptocracy. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that we fundamentally need to realize that all humans have multiple incentives and systems have multiple incentives. So you can also find counter incentives to be able to shift them. And then I think the third, to your point, that 9 out of 10 solutions might fail, I think that there's also creating supporting the tools, even if the time's not right, so that you are ready when you see a window of opportunity and opening. And we see those in this space. Things shift in societies that can actually create a space where there's a window. And if we have the resources or the tools or the approaches ready, then we're better able to take advantage or to capitalize on those.
Yeah, just to say, sometimes for us, a test of buy-in and sustainability is what happens when administrations change. So let's say we've done the co-design, we've done training, it's now fully handed over, right, to our client. For us, it was interesting. We worked on a project called Vialidad in Argentina, where we worked with the National Department of Transportation on opening all of the tender-related information since 2016. There's a change of administration, and we were curious, is the website going to continue to be, run? And sure enough, it is, and it's updated through 2022 numbers, so that you were kind of always holding our breath, but I think, when you do step away fully, it's a test of, did the systems in place, did the discussions with the individuals there, did it really take? And then we have to let go and see what does take.
Coming back to the humans behind the tools, that makes me think of how important it is to have career civil servants in those rooms, and not just people with elected power or political appointees who come and go, right? Because people change in the system, but it's finding those champions who are stable and who are there in it for the long run. We had one question over there, and as we come close to the end of our session, would love to invite others up, and we can take a final round of questions before we wrap up, if there's anything else. And comments and lessons, of course.
Good morning. So funny that you mentioned career civil servants, because guess what? So I'm Andrew Lyons. I'm with HMRC, the UK Tax Authority. It's been a really interesting conversation. And I come from a department and a country where we're very rich in data. We're very fortunate to have good resources, and we're brilliant at using it. But so what? Actually, our challenge then is when you've got such scale, how do you then use it effectively? I was really interested in particularly the comments around dashboards that you were making, because we have to come forward to meet the challenges of, so where do we prioritize and what do we do? And I've got a few questions if that's okay. So I think the dashboard idea links to the query about the Kenyan lack of activism. And I kind of wonder, and I feel that dashboards showing the right information, being salient to the audience that are receiving it, do you think that actually helps to drive activism and increase democracy? And And then as someone who, I work in the risk and intelligence side of things, so I'm lucky enough to own data teams, so we are always looking for innovative ways of doing things. And there are two things that have been particularly powerful for me in the last 7 years, which is the way we've used behavioral science and behavioral insight. And I've been a little surprised over the course of the week that more hasn't been made of behavioral science, because that's such a powerful tool. It can impact government, it can impact individuals and lead to change. And then the other one is commissioning for outcomes. I'm not sure the degree of awareness that is. But when we have public spending challenges, and it's kind of, we have, X £100,000 available and 3 challenges, and there's been some really unique ways of bringing those 3 problems together to spend the money once. And without going into too much detail, we had asylum seekers, and our rules don't allow them to work, so they couldn't integrate into the community. We had social care issues that were too expensive to meet. And we had meeting spaces which weren't being used effectively. And actually, we brought all those people together and had the asylum seekers working with people needing social care, gaining local credits to use facilities, and creating integration. It's just one small thing. So commissioning and behavioral insight.
I'm going to go as fast as I can because we don't have much time left. So on the dashboards, I don't believe it always works to put dashboards before people. I was talking to Dan Nielsen, who's a professor who presented about his work in Uganda, and when he showed people kind of like this little dashboard that showed government resources from aid and from budgets and so forth, one of their unanticipated side effects was that people got really upset. They're like, all this money is coming from aid, all this money is in the budget, I never see that money. And it kind of reinforced their anger at the government for being irresponsible, even if maybe the government most of the time is actually using that money well. And so I think you have to be careful about who sees the dashboards and what information is there. I think the narrative building and storytelling is actually probably better because it's easier to control what the impact is of that message, and leaving the dashboards to a more select group of people. At least that's what I would imagine. On the behavioral side, I think that is behavioral insight, is figuring out when you do an intervention, what the result was, and trying to find the intervention that has the result that you're looking for. I think that is applying behavioral insights. And I like the idea of social pressure. Like the right kind of social pressure can get people to kind of let go of maybe their corrupt gains because they're ashamed, or they're willing now to let go because of the right kind of pressure. And then on the commissioning outcomes, I think that's in certain circumstances, you just have to be practical and say we need to commission an outcome. It's Apollo 13. We need to figure out a way to build this thing using these materials in these 17 hours or our astronauts will die. But in other times, in the longer term perspective, it's commissioning communities. We're building communities for the long run because we don't know what the solution will be, but we know that if there's a community here to build it, then it will eventually come.
So, I talked a little bit earlier about being very careful when it comes to beneficial ownership data about what's shared and why, and let's be very thoughtful about that. And to your point on what is public, what becomes a dashboard, what makes sense, we have built a corruption risk dashboard for some of our clients, and those are not public, right? Those are meant for the procurement officials. So I think there's a decision made there in terms of what makes sense to be open data versus what shouldn't be for, at the end of the day, for there to be an anti-corruption system in place. Just to say, you asked this really interesting question, does the data being available to the public drive advocacy? What I would say is it's, from the teams that I manage, from the projects I've seen, it supports advocates to do their job more effectively, right? So we've heard stories about really excellent, individuals, organizations who are doing this work, and now they're able to pull data or to pull stories that cement their messaging, right? So that when they get pushback, they have that data available. I'm going to tell a quick story, and it's just for you because it's related to a tax authority. And I promise this is interesting, whether or not you work in a tax authority. But just to say, you know, we built a dashboard that related to taxes on excisable products, specifically tobacco products. So, you know, there's an illicit trade that happens where companies are avoiding paying taxes because they're effectively illegally selling cigarettes, right, that haven't been taxed. And there was an official meeting between the Ministry of Finance and a tobacco industry, right, where the industry officials were talking about how they shouldn't raise taxes and how it's going to drive the economy into a tailspin, which we know through the research is not true. The finance official, after they wrapped up that meeting with the tobacco industry, went to our website that aggregated information on tax and research to check, to validate, is what I heard in the meeting true or not? So I think that's the kind of situation where it's a trusted source of information. You know, is that advocacy? No. But if we're looking at really making sure that we're getting the right data and the right format to the right people at the right time, it's a piece in the puzzle. Right? Whether that's developed or delivered by a civil society advocate or someone who came up with the idea in the hackathon or came from the official themselves.
So I'm going to expand your question from dashboards themselves to just information. And I think that, I think we all know this, but we as a community are substantially improving our efforts on increasing information around corruption and corrupt practices. And that is a necessary but not sufficient component and can in fact backfire if we don't simultaneously have accountability from that information. If there are no consequences from the action, if the information is out there, it can actually undermine our cause. And so I think part of what we as a community, our opportunity, our challenge is also to strengthen our efforts to be able to link the information to sanctions. And when I say sanctions, I'm using the term broadly, not just being on a list from the US government or another government, but thinking about what are the implications of that information being public. Are there social sanctions? Are there consequences to the information that's out there, and thinking through how do we as a community work together and engage with other communities to be able to ensure that as we're shedding more light on corruption, we're not just doing the transparency, but also the accountability piece. And I think Administrator Power in her opening remarks, really emphasized that the three pillars of USAID's policy on addressing corruption are both reducing opportunities for corruption while also increasing the costs of that, which information is a component of, again, necessary but not sufficient, and then also incentivizing integrity. So what is the flip side of the accountability component to ensure that integrity is also rewarded and incentivized?
That was a really rich question, and what an honor to have an actual career civil servant come up, our end user in many ways. We have 5 minutes left and would love to just give our wonderful panelists who've shared such really practical examples this morning a minute to wrap up with any final thoughts.
I think this has been great, and just to re-say something that I think we mentioned earlier, and I'm sure has kind of been driven home, but tech and data are the easy problems, right? It's the people problems where we need to invest. So really, focusing on that, looking at processes, looking at the social component, and I think just, again, sharing these case studies, whether they're the hackathons or the innovation challenges or the portals that are making a difference, what is the difference being made, and really spreading that information out so that we can generate even more interest and demand and see people who may not historically be engaged in anti-corruption, see how it's improving government service delivery and really improving outcomes and making people's lives better.
So I'm going to do a shameless plug at the end because I think we've hit on some very consistent themes. So the first thing, if you aren't already aware, we have an open call for innovation that's focused on promoting transparency and accountability and integrity in green mineral supply chains. You can grab a postcard. We welcome solutions. We also welcome technical experts who want to help our solvers, as we've been talking about a lot today, to have the solutions be sustainable. And we also welcome your I have to phrase this carefully. Please do not send us concept notes because USAID has non-corrupt practices and we do open competitions for our resources, but we welcome ideas from the community in terms of the spaces, what are the questions what are the challenges where innovation would be useful in solving, where are there spaces where we need to be looking for more innovative solutions, and you can email us at challengecorruption@usaid.gov if you have some steers or areas where you think this is really ripe for looking for a wide range of innovative solutions.
Awesome. So many good things were just said. I'll just really quickly say, when I was invited to be in this panel, I didn't believe that I had anything to say because buy-in just sounds impossible, right? Like buy-in, like how can we prove buy-in? Like buy-in is exactly what we're striving for. And at the time we were, we just had the hackathon. We were trying to go from hackathon to boot camp to try to prepare these winning teams to make these solutions that they've started a little bit more real, a little bit more practical, a little bit more ready to go to market. And I was thinking to myself, well, we haven't gotten to buy-in yet. There's a 3-stage cycle. We're on like the end of the first one, and stage 3 is buy-in and kind of establishing it in the market. But really, there are principles of buy-in that we can learn, and I think we've been able to articulate those really well. It's these principles of remember that these are humans. Remember that government officials and civil society people and businesses, they're not automatons. Like these are human beings, and because they're human beings, they can be appealed to, they can be persuaded, and we can build communities that last. And as we reflect on that, I think we can find solutions that do last. I'm sure in Argentina, because the problem with Argentina is that all the civil servants change every administration, which isn't incredible, but it happens, is that if a tool is well respected enough, if it is talked about well enough, even if you get a whole new group of civil servants, they're going to be like, oh, well, they spoke really good things about this solution. They said this was great. It really solved a lot of their problems. And, when people talk about, hey, that was, when we worked with that civil society group, they really helped. Or when we implemented that tech tool, like it made our lives so much easier. That kind of person-to-person communication that persuades people over time matters too. And it's not the technology that did it. It was the people that shared that. So remember the human element, and the technology will work.
Thank you so much, Brooke, Andrea, and Ben, for sharing really generously of your own experiences and of your time preparing a really robust conversation, and to you all for picking this panel out of many on the agenda for today. We really appreciate your participation, the thoughtful questions, and for being here. And I maybe just want to leave you with one final note that was brought up earlier, and it's around not doubling efforts. There are many of us already doing a variety of things, and at this conference in this very room, there are people who can and should be collaborating. So let's keep our eyes open for that, and let's be good shepherds of resources by not doubling down on things, but rather collaborating and forming our own really diverse communities of organizations working on things collectively. Thank you.